I attended one of these public policy sessions of the Ananta Aspen Center or Ananta Center today. And I have with me, this is my description, the dream team of economists of India. Once upon a time, there was a dream team in the 90s, remember?
Keep reading.
Yeah. And a couple of you were part of that dream team. And NITIN by that time had escaped to the cooler climates of the United Nations in New York in the 90s. But all three of them have been chief economic advisors in the finance ministry. SHANKAR has held that position for all of 8 years. And all those 8 years, he had to tolerate me. And I would barge into his room, and he was not sure whether the private sector was trying to take over the finance ministry or not. Push me back and push me out of the door. But these are the finest economic thinkers in the country, the three of them. According to newspaper reports, all three were invited to the ritual pre-budget discussions with the finance minister. 2 attended. 1 was notable for his absence. But he made up for it by going to the prime minister's meeting for 40 economists. So they are still called in and occasionally consulted. I'm not sure whether they're listened to. Probably not.
Not at all.
So we're going to start in alphabetical order. They don't need an introduction. You have their CVs. I think you're here because it's amazing. I think the notice went out 4 days ago. And I congratulate you, Shujit, and through you, Kiran, for this amazing turnout. Not just numbers, but quality. And I'll start, and I'll go by alphabetical order, Shankar. And I thought if we avoid too much of history of what went wrong and what we should have done, but maybe focus in your 10, 12 minutes that each of you have on really what we need to do, because the economy is facing many challenges. And this is not just about the budget. Budget is just one. It's a big event of the year, but it's not about budget only. It's about what India, in terms of economic policy, needs to do to bring growth back and to bring higher growth back. According to Abhijit Banerjee of MIT, he made a presentation last year where he said that we've actually enjoyed very high growth for many years. There have been some doubts recently about that, but I don't exactly buy that. Harvard studies, you did your PhD in Harvard.
Yeah.
I think Harvard is not the same anymore. So I'll start with you,
okay,
then go to NITIN, and then last to Rakesh. And then we will get into a conversation and bring the audience in for a Q&A. Shankar.
Would you like us to speak from here? Or?
Yes, please. Yes.
Okay. All right. I always feel somehow for an audience like this, I should stand.
No.
Distinguished audience. Well, first of all, my thanks to Tarun and his colleagues in Ananta for getting us all together, inviting me and my friends and all of you. Secondly, my thanks to all of you for, in the heat of the afternoon, as opposed to the old movie, what was it, The Heat of the Night? That one with a black detective in Mississippi trying to solve a crime in the 1950s. But anyway, I'm getting distracted. So thank you all for coming. And I hope you, when you leave, you feel that it hasn't been a complete waste of time. And of course, it's a great pleasure to have NITIN and Rakesh as co-panelists. Time is of the essence, and I'll try and stick to the matter. As Tarun guided, won't go into history, but let's take 2 minutes to just look at the current situation as one sees it, or at least as I see it. I'm going to limit myself to, if you like, the macro situation rather than go into any individual sectors, whether it be agriculture or industry or social sectors or various kinds, or water or so many other, any area one can pick up, one can find a lot of issues to discuss. I'll stick to what is traditional macroeconomic focus. And I guess my first broad point is that when I look at the recent macro trends, every major dimension of macro seems to be, the trends are negative, the recent short-term trends. And let me illustrate. I should say almost every. The one thing that is not negative is inflation, but everything else is. Growth, as we all know, has been slowing. Whether you take a 3-year period, the most recent year or 5-year period, most recent year has been the slowest in the last 5 years by the official data. There is the whole separate issue that Tarun was referring to about data issues of measuring GDP, growth in GDP and so forth. I won't get into that. But using just the official data, it's very straight. Growth has slowed down in the last year to the slowest it has been in the past 5 years. More importantly, I think his growth in the most recent quarter has slowed to the lowest in the last 20 quarters of below 6% now. It's 5.8. Now, of course, these numbers will get revised, but we don't know which way it'll go. So that's growth. Second, and this is one which I worry most about, perhaps because I've lived long enough or I'm old enough to have had some memory of the early 90s balance of payments crisis, which led to good things afterwards. Exports, and I'm now first talking about merchandise exports, has been stagnant essentially for 7 years, essentially from 2011-12 in value dollar terms. And if you look at another way of looking at it, exports as a share of GDP, which I think is a better way of looking at it, that share, which was 17% of GDP in 2011-12, in 2018-19 stood at 12%. That's really a significant decline, and it worries me both in terms of our engagement with the global economy, or lack of it, dropping, and also because what it means for our external financing and external vulnerability and potential vulnerability on that side. Because if you look at merchandise exports, it's the single most important earner of foreign exchange, to put it in old-fashioned terms. Associated with that, as you'd expect, as exports share declining, the deficit in the balance of payments, particularly what economists call the current account deficit in the balance of payments, or CAD for short, last year was at a rather close to what I would call a worrying high, not a high, but a worrying level, about 2.5, 2.6% of GDP. I say about because the final numbers are about to be released, I think, in the coming week by the RBI, so haven't come out. But the first 3 quarters suggest a current account deficit of 2.5 to 2.6% of GDP. So exports, I think, is a big issue, or not enough of them. Investment, of course, is very important for growth as well as aggregate demand, and that has also been slowing over the last few years. Not steadily. There have been 1 or 2 years where it's sort of picked up, but the most recent year, or let's just take the most recent quarter, the final quarter of last year, the growth in gross fixed investment has been lowly 3%, which means that its share is also dropping. And private investment, since investment, there's public investment, there's private investment has been pretty much stagnant for the last few years as a share of GDP, if not declining. Another thing that macro we look at is, of course, and you hear about a lot, and you will hear much more now with the budget coming up, is the fiscal deficit. Everybody will focus on the fiscal deficit of the center, but as economists, one should really look at the fiscal deficit of the center and states together. And that continues to be at a pretty high level of 7% of GDP, give or take, which is on the high side if you look at countries across the world. And reason one worries about the fiscal deficit is that that's a measure of the annual borrowing of the government sector taken together, because the deficit has to be financed. And if government is financing and taking away that much funds from the market for loanable funds, there's less left over for everybody else, including the private sector, to do their investment. Indeed, in the most recent year, I think there's also been a bit of a lurch towards doing more than usual dressing up of the central fiscal deficit. Budgeted at 3.4%, the centre's deficit, comes out at 3.4. But that despite an enormous shortfall of 1.7 trillion rupees between RE and accounts figures on the revenue side, which has never happened before. And essentially, I won't go into the details of the dressing up, but essentially it's meant transferring expenditures which should have been done by the government, like food subsidies, a lot of it anyway, to public enterprise like the Food Corporation of India, and having them borrow. So it doesn't show up in the budget. But of course it means that a public enterprise is having to do a lot of borrowing, which probably it shouldn't be doing, at least not that much. And that's why it's perhaps more important to look now at what's called the PSBR, or the Public Sector Borrowing Requirement, which is often done in many countries, but not here. And if you look at the PSBR, recent estimate by a younger, more capable economist than myself suggests that it's at 9% of GDP. And when you juxtapose that with the flow of household financial saving, which is 7.5% of GDP, it means essentially that the government is borrowing all that households are saving on a flow basis. So there isn't much left over for anybody else. Employment situation, the report that was not released for several months but was finally released May 31, suggests that our employment, unemployment, underemployment situation today is at its worst juncture in several decades. Just to give you some numbers, what we call the labor force participation rate, which is just the share of total employment, actual people with jobs or seeking jobs, the share of working age population. For the first time since these data were kept in India, that's dropped below half, below 50%, 49 point something percent. Secondly, this LFPR for short, labor force participation rate, is, I think, dismally low for women or females at something like 23%. And for youth amongst females, it's even more distressingly low at 16%. And one hasn't seen numbers like this in India, as far as I can recall. These are comparable to sort of outlier countries, which I won't take up time mentioning. And the unemployment rate, which actually is not that great a measure of how well we are doing or not doing, stood at 6.1%, which is the highest in 45 years. As I mentioned, inflation is the one positive story. Consumer price inflation is still hovering around 3%. But then if you take out food and fuel, even that one is not that low. It's closer to 5% and rising. Two other dimensions of macroeconomy I would just touch on where I think you should worry about. One is the financial sector, banks, including non-bank financial sector, NBFCs. These, as we know, banks have been stressed because of bad loans and so on for several years, half a dozen perhaps. And NBFCs, we now know, despite a boom in recent years, are now getting stressed. Their business model is not working that well after the implosion of the ILFS, which you must have all read about in the last few months. Finally, the global outlook for the economy, after all, India lives in the world, is, I would say, somewhat weak and uncertain, both for economic and related geopolitical reasons. We can go into the reasons, and people here know much more about those. Now, let's turn to the second bit of my remarks, and do give me a 2-minute warning, if you will, Tarun. What can be done in the short run to revive growth, employment, and hopefully exports as well? Well, the normal thing, the one kind of thing, tendency is to say, let's stimulate the economy. Whatever fiscal deficit we have, let's just make it higher and stimulate the economy. I would submit, and not everybody will agree on this, I know, but I will submit that when our existing fiscal deficit, center and states together, is already at a high 7% of GDP, if not higher because of all this dressing up, and government debt to GDP is somewhere now 70%, and the PSBR is somewhere around 9% of GDP, that we are doing pretty much all the stimulation that needs to be done to the economy. And this is not the way to go. It reminds me of more of 1989, 90 when we used to run big deficits, and bad things happened after that, as we know, in 1990, 91. So I would say, I would urge that in the budget and so on coming next week, that government should try their best to hold the already announced interim budget level of 3.4% of GDP, though perhaps a little more transparently than last year. Better still if it could be shrunk a little, but one should be realistic, I suppose. The other obvious thing to do from a macro point of view in a time of slowing growth is to stimulate not through the fisc, but through the monetary side by expanding money supply, reducing interest rates, and so forth. And that's been happening in the last few months, certainly. But the transmission of what, say, the RBI has been doing in reducing short-term policy rates is not occurring very much for good reason. And the good reason in the following sense. When you have the kind of high deficits that we have, the long-term rates don't decline much because of the pressure in the market for long-term funds. Secondly, as I mentioned, the high non-performing assets of banks and of NBFCs means that levels of various kinds of risk and credit costs are high. And so banks and NBFCs really don't have the wherewithal to reduce rates because they just want to claw back what money they can from the system. And third, of course, at the deposit side of banks, they don't want to lower their deposit rates much, aside from we as savers would all complain, but for the other reason that small saving rates are not being reduced by the government. Until very recently, there's been very talk about it, but I don't know whether they will. And so banks say if we reduce our deposit rates, we'll just lose more money to small savings. Money won't come down to us, so we won't be able to lend out. So overall, attempts at looser monetary policy, which are going on, I don't think are working very much, and I don't think they will work very much. They will work to some extent. It won't be completely. Where I think we have more scope for doing something useful, though there's no silver bullet here, I must say, is on our trade and exchange rate policy. Over the last few years, by most measures that we have by the RBI, official indices and so forth, our rupee exchange rate, not just with respect to dollars, but a basket of currencies, adjusted for inflation, has been, in fact, valuing up. That means that our rupee is getting more and more overvalued in the last 4 years or 5 years. And this is not, and I think that's been one of the causes of our rather flat export performance, by no means the only cause, but one of them. And I think we should try, as we used to do when, as Tarun mentioned, I was in the government in the 90s, in conjunction and cooperation with the Reserve Bank of India, to manage the exchange rate in a way as to disallow, or at least moderate this kind of overvaluation that we have seen. I remember the last time I looked at those numbers closely, between January 2014 and January 2018, the real effective exchange rate, as we call it, after you adjust for inflation in other countries and take all the currencies, all the relevant currencies, had upvalued by something like 20%, and I don't think it's changed much since. We shouldn't be there. We should try and manage it so that it comes down a bit. And that will help, I think, both in terms of not just exports, but it will also, I think, help in reducing the pressure for customs tariff hikes. Because when you think about what a rupee depreciation does, it's like not bit, it's almost identically, its economic effect is identical on the trade account to, if you have a 10% depreciation, it's like a 10% subsidy to all exports and a 10% customs duty all across the board. So it's much better to do this kind of quasi-protection, if you like, through the exchange rate than through selective customs duties of the kind that we've been doing as in the 2018 budget. So I think that those policies need. And also I think this will help us participate better in the global value chains, which we haven't been very effective in doing for many years. One other thing that will help us participate in GVCs, as they're called, is of course if we aggressively participate, I don't mean aggressively in the sense of disagreement, but rather actively participate in regional trading arrangements, especially against a background where the WTO is clearly weakening because the US is letting it down. And so something like regional comprehensive economic partnership in Asia is, I think, an organization which we should help get into and build and participate in. So that's on the, I think on the trade and exchange rate side, we do have some room for maneuver to improve policy. One other thing I think we can do in the short run is announce a credible set of reforms, whether these be in the labor market, land market, agricultural marketing, or a number of other possibilities. But some package, even if the payoff for these reforms is in the medium term rather than the short term, the announcement effect could lift animal spirits as far as investors in industry and so forth are concerned and bring about more investment. Because I think our short-term goal has to be to try and manage the economy so you have more private investment, out of that more growth, and more employment. And I do feel that fiscal policy is already doing what it can. Monetary policy may not be very effective. Trade and exchange rate policy can go some distance, but I think a big reforms thrust will also help. Finally, of course, as everybody tends to agree, we should do everything possible to make the ease of doing business, both domestic business and foreign trade, much easier. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shankar. Thank you very much. Nitin?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Happy to be here. And I think after Shankar has spoken, Shankar has given you a good sense of, how shall I say, how unhealthy the economy is. So I'm not going to go into that. And focus more on what I think the government ought to be thinking about. Whether, well, what not block or what comes to the same thing in today's India, 10 Racecourse Road, should be thinking about. It seems to me that there are 4 or 5 areas where where people are waiting for a substantial change of outlook. One is in corporate investment. One of the characteristics of the past few years in India has been the stagnation in corporate investment. And there are many reasons which are given for this. One reason given is that a whole lot of corporations have overinvested, they are debt strapped, they are too busy deleveraging to even think about investments. That's possibly true. There are about a quarter of our large corporations are in that category. But 3/4 are not. And the fact is that I'm not sure that the reason they're not investing can be entirely understood in terms of interest rates and so on. Right now, the numbers that I have before me are the cash that the corporations are holding in mutual funds. The numbers for March 2019 is the latest that I could get hold of. 78% of the funds in liquid MFs, liquid money market MFs, 87% in ETFs other than gold, 60% in gilts, 50% in debt-oriented funds are held by corporates. The total amount of cash that they're holding in this sense is about 800,000 crores. So there are corporations out there which are actually flush with money, and they're not investing. And I think we should ask ourselves, why is it that corporations which are flush with money which are investing in relatively low return liquid funds, which are giving them maybe 5-6% or something, why are they not spending the money and investing it? I think the basic reason is there is a genuine sense of demand growth pessimism out there. That basically the demand growth that they have actually experienced has been significantly less than what they were expecting when they were doing their capacity investments. And this is what is holding them back. You're seeing evidence of this all the time. You see, right now in the motor car industry, you're seeing it in a spectacular way with the sort of drop in sales that is taking place. And it seems to me that the thing that the government should be focusing on is convincing corporate boardrooms that demand growth is going to revive. What are the sources of demand growth which really drove corporate growth in the past? One very important one was export growth, which Shankar mentioned. If you see the high growth period of the 2004-2008 time, export growth was an important component of what drove corporate growth at that time. The second was the boom in rural demand. Rural demand growth, particularly with the FMCGs and so on. The third was the growth in durables, which was partly driven by the phenomenal expansion of the NBFCs, the non-banking financial companies, which were lending for these purposes, including in housing, investment, spending, and so on. All of these are in trouble. On the export side, Shankar has already elaborated what is happening. They don't see export growth in front of them, certainly not any significant increase in demand. People are talking in terms of, oh, let India step into the areas China is vacating. It's not that easy. You need it's not that easy to just walk into that market. Similar, on the NBFC side, we know what's happening. That the demand growth, which may have been fueled by the ready availability of loans for durables, for housing, has significantly come down because of all the problems that you have in the NBFCs. Rural demand growth has more or less collapsed. And most people who are in the FMCG business will say that and tell you that. And the reasons we know are partly because of the distress in the rural areas. And the only thing which has kept the growth rate going, if you like, is possibly public spending. That the public spending has been there at the cost, perhaps, of us getting to a point at which our debt GDP ratios are getting a little problematic. Remember this, you see, people say, oh, your debt GDP ratio is 70%, Japan is 250%. But Japan has almost a negative interest rate. You have a 7% interest rate. You know, there's a huge difference in terms of budgetary management. You can having a large debt GDP ratio in a country with 1% interest rates is one thing, but a very high debt GDP ratio in a country where the interest rates tend to be 6, 7, 8% is a very different story. So I would say that that particular potential of just relying on public spending as the basis for maintaining a sense of demand growth. And remember this, public spending only affects a limited class of industries, because most of public spending is essentially on construction type activities. What I think can be done is perhaps within the framework of public spending, there are areas where I believe the link between spending and impact on investments, demand growth at the industry level can be improved. Defense procurement for areas of infrastructure spending like metro rail and so on. There, almost all of the spending goes out. Very little of that public spending on defense or on high quality infrastructure like metro rail actually has a demand impact within the country, a limited amount in terms of labor, but very modest compared to what it could be if we had better policies. I say this because I believe that one of the things we can possibly look at is small microeconomic changes in policy which improve this linkage. We can't afford to go and increase the budget deficit and keep on spending, but we can start doing things which are much more systematic in translating public demand, public procurement demand into something which has an impact on industry. To me, this is something that I would look for in this budget. Are there clear enough signals that that industry can expect and some improvement in the prospects of demand growth? The rural areas are a different, are a clear problem area. Rural distress is something that everybody has been talking about. The answers are long-term. There are probably no quick short-term answers. One only thing I would emphasize is again a dimension which Shankar stressed, the trade dimension. It's not that easy to keep a booming rural economy going. They necessarily produce things whose demand elasticity within the country is low. You can't help it. This is a reality. Yes, they can move to higher value products, and this is happening. Today, for instance, the dairy industry accounts for a larger chunk of the value added than the cereal production industry. The dairy industry is an interesting example of what we ought to be doing in other areas. It is the one industry where you did not have things like APMC and so on. You did not have this restriction which prevented a national market from emerging. You did not have the restrictions which prevented an expansion in value added, which brought greater income and therefore a willingness on the part of farmers to invest in new, for instance, hybrid animals, better feed, and also all sorts of things like that. But I'm not going to elaborate on that story later, maybe in the questions. But I do believe the dairy industry gives us some clue as to what can be done in other areas in order to modernize our entire agricultural system. It's not simply a matter of ICRIER throwing new technology at farmers. It's a whole complex thing, from the farmers through the processing system, through the marketing logistics system, to urban marketing, everything. All of that has to change. But we have failed to do the equivalent of what we did in milk in any other agricultural area. We just haven't succeeded. And we should ask ourselves, why? Is it because we haven't had a Tribhuvandas Patel and a Kurian? But that's a very limited explanation. I don't think that's the only answer. I think we need to look at that. I hope that at least, he talked of reform. To me, the biggest single area of reform which can make a difference is this. Incidentally, it's not as if the bulk of the increase, India is today the largest producer of dairy products in the world. It's not that the bulk of the increase has come from cooperatives. They have played a key role, but they only account for about 20 to 25%. The remaining stuff has come from the modern private sector, the modernized private sector. But the cooperative development was the stuff which Tribhuvandas Patel and Kurian started off in Khera district, has engendered that whole other area. This is the thing that we ought to be doing. A third area that we have to start worrying about seriously is, of course, the so-called small industry sector and so on, which has... Now, part of the problems of that sector are that we have created a policy environment which allowed them to, how shall I say, earn their money through policy leverage. Basically evading taxes, evading labor laws, etc., etc. But I believe there is potential for a small industry sector, a medium industry sector, which is fully modernized, which is fully integrated. And in many ways, I think GST will, in the medium and long run, help in this area. I already see evidence of this, that you have a big company which refuses to trade with any small company which is not in the GST. And those guys they were being forced to become part of the formal modern system. They can't become part of the GST system if they don't start obeying the different laws. And if they start obeying the laws, they cannot make profits unless they actually run better and more efficiently and so on. And this is happening. It may take time, but I hope to see signals which would allow, give some room for improvement. Not this not sort of vague schemes like Mudra and so on. It needs something a little more focused, a little more organized than what is happening. In many ways, you have to create incentives for the large industry to generate support for small industry, instead of just trying to do it through public policy. Finally, since I'm running out of time, let me say that much of this would become very difficult unless they resolve the problems of the capital market, particularly in the NBFCs. Those NBFCs are very, very important. In any developing, growing economy, the multiplication, the elaboration of financial intermediation is absolutely central. And the sort of problems that we are facing in the NBFC sector are, apart from the sorts of difficulties for industry that it is leading to in terms of demand growth, there are broader problems in terms of small industry development, in terms of the sorts of things I've talked about in agriculture, which should be held back if we didn't address this. So I would expect to see something on that in the NBFC, in the budget. I'm probably slightly less sort of, if you like, conservative about the deficit than maybe Shankar would be, or some others may be. But that's, I suppose, partly an age-related thing. I grew up in Cambridge, so and after all, I was the chief economic advisor in the 89-90 that he was talking about.
So you got us in there.
So
you were the one.
Yeah,
you were the one who left us with the crisis. So.
No. You got it absolutely wrong. The crisis came because I left you.
Quite right. Quite right.
Rakesh.
Thank you very much, Tarun and the Ananta Center, for putting this together. Since I mostly now live in the US, it's a particular opportunity to see friends and interact. But first, a complaint, actually. Shankar mentioned the incredibly low labor force participation of women. There's also even lower participation of the gender ratio here is disgraceful. You must tell Kiran that she's obviously not doing a job properly. A special effort for that. Now, by the way, I do notice this all the time now, since I did participate in a couple of studies to do with women labor force across the world. And India is a complete outlier, actually. And among many other things in terms of the economy, there's a demand issue, of course, but just think that if the Indian female labor force participation went up to anything near Southeast Asia, how much increase there would be in the economy of the country. There's a demand issue, I understand. But so that's just the first to begin with, since I was observing the audience.
In my time in CII, we had 50% women executives.
Well, obviously your friends are not doing the same job here at Ananta Center. So, okay. Now, what do I say after these guys have, my immediate predecessor as Chief Economic Advisor, Shankar, and of course, you were once removed, I think, between him and by the time Shankar showed up. But I think most issues have been covered, so to some extent, what I'm doing is a bit like embroidery on what they've said. To some extent, Shankar was much more macro. To a certain extent, Nitin covered many micro issues. First general point, actually. To my mind, and this to some extent it's covered by them, the key issue really is to bring back the objective of high economic growth as the key top policy focus of all economic policy making. It is amazing that in a country with low per capita income, still of less than $2,000 per capita, that this has not been seen as the top policy focus for at least 5 years, if not longer. You have to recall, even though despite Nitin's long innings in the Planning Commission, this is where I first met him in 1980 when I first came back to the country, and we worked together for 3 years at the Planning Commission. Despite his long innings there, it sort of has a bad name. But if you actually look at the data, right from the time the Planning Commission was founded through all the 5-year plans, the the achievement of targets of what was given as targets in the 5-year plan is 90% average, 90%. Obviously, sometimes it was exceeded and sometimes, of course, much lower. But the point of mentioning that is that right from the beginning of policy making after independence, growth targeting has always been very important until recently. So today, we have no idea what is our growth target. And B, we have no idea what is the growth target. We certainly have no idea on how whatever we are doing will be achieved actually. And therefore, it's, one of the courses I do teach currently is strategies for economic development, where I have focused particularly on countries that have successfully grown fast for a long time. And two conclusions. One, it is extremely difficult to grow fast for a long time. There are very handful of countries. Now, of course, with China having joined that group, the proportion of population, of course, is very high now in terms of who have succeeded. But it doesn't happen by chance. It does not happen with business as usual. There has to be an absolutely top-level policy focus to achieve high growth. So that, to my mind, is the number one issue which needs to be addressed. And I think it does mean redesign of the Niti Aayog in terms of having that policy focus and also having the power to do something about it in terms of both the government's own priorities, priority setting, fund allocation, etc., but also communication to the private sector. Look, this is what we are about. So the private sector understands that, look, this is where the country is going, so they make their own plans, which is to some extent, I think, some of the issues that you addressed in terms of the private sector not investing, apart from the demand issues and so on, that you have no idea what our priorities are, what the sectoral allocations or sectoral growth, etc., can be. Coupled with this, to my mind, once again, there's been excessive recent discussion, particularly among my colleague economists, of their fascination for more efficient cash transfers. That just because of technology being available to do cash transfers directly to people's bank accounts, so I have no quarrel with, of course, Jan Dhan, etc., in the sense that, yes, it is very good that we have done that so that just about everyone does have a bank account. But there's been a huge focus among economists of doing what I would say premature, silly ideas of universal basic income. There is absolutely no way we can afford it. If we have that money, this was in the Congress manifesto, which would have been about 360,000 crores a year or something like that, if I remember correctly the number. Imagine if you invested 360, I mean, that was the policy slogan from the BN opposition. 360,000 crores of giving money away. Where is that money? If you had that money, imagine the amount of demand you would generate if you invested that in schools, in hospitals, in clinics, in rural roads, urban infrastructure, overall infrastructure, etc. I'm just mentioning this to point out that the focus from growth has gone away to distribution. I'm not against distribution at all because I think that's essential, but in the right way. So just the first point on where to go. Second, and this is connected, of course, and Shankar talked about all the numbers to do with savings and investment and so on. A big puzzle that exists, which I have not found any explanation, I don't understand it, that one interesting thing was that right from independence till the early 1990s, there was a constant increase in savings as a whole in the country as a proportion of GDP and of household financial savings. By the early 1990s, the household financial savings had reached around 10% of GDP. And they remained at that level, around 10% of GDP, over the next 20 years, till about the late 2000s. Around 10% of GDP. Actually, the gross financial savings of the households had gone up faster, but because of the financial development with more lending to households for consumer durables plus housing, etc., their liabilities or the borrowing had gone up also, so the net didn't increase as much, but the gross financial savings had been increasing. A big puzzle, which I'm not able to find any explanation and understanding from the data, is that after around 2011-12 or so, that has come down to around 7%. The 10% from 10% net financial savings of households to around 7% net financial savings in the last 6-7 years. And Shankar, as you were saying, that with the, forget the PSBR, just the government borrowing being 7%, there's nothing left. Okay, there's nothing left. An indicator of that, recent indicator is that to my memory, the first time ever that the Reserve Bank's open market operations in 2018-19, Reserve Bank actually financed the government 70% of all borrowing. That is, Reserve Bank bought government bonds in the market through open market operations of 70% of all government net borrowing. That's an indicator of lack of financial savings in the country. Second, a more recent indicator actually is that the liquidity injection the Reserve Bank has done through a new instrument, that is swaps, of two $5 billion auctions of swaps. So they've injected $10 billion, what I call artificial insemination of liquidity into the country. $10 billion, that is 70,000 crores, through straightforward foreign borrowing. Straightforward foreign borrowing. What has the Reserve Bank done? They've done swaps. They have to pay back that 10 billion to the banks from whom they've borrowed through a swap measure. So after 3 years, they have to pay back that $10 billion. So you've injected 70,000 crores worth of liquidity into the system in the last couple of months by borrowing from abroad. You're assuming by 3 years from now, dekha jayega, you know. For what, right? And having done this, yet there's a clamor from private industry for credit, for further loosening, both fiscal and monetary. And I think, as Shankar was saying, that the way I understand it, the core of this problem is this fall in net household financial savings. I said, I don't understand where that money has gone. I don't understand what has happened. And actually, if you look at bank deposit growth, that's really come down, actually. And the NBFC issue, Nitin, is very interesting because in our system, I'll come back to that in a second, that what other strange thing which I also once again don't understand is one might have expected that as aging is taking place, as urbanization is taking place, as joint family system is breaking up, particularly in urban areas, that you might have thought that, and as incomes have been increasing, you might have thought that there will be a huge increase in the last 20 years, 15 years, 10 years, in people's savings in provident funds, pension funds, life insurance, etc. That hasn't happened. You don't see hardly any change. These are all as proportion of GDP. So my general point here is that the government really need that in order to be able to get higher growth, whether it's the public sector, whether it's the private sector, whether it is the households, there is no money for investment. And it can only come if you first understand what has happened to financial savings and then, of course, do something about it. I do believe that you need to incentivize and really promote contractual savings, because that's good for the financial sector as well as for social security for people, particularly with the, as I say, breakdown of joint family system, greater urbanization, etc. So to my mind, this is a really important, that is, a lot of the other stuff focuses on this. And this is why, as Shankar says, that everyone constantly clamors the Reserve Bank should reduce interest rate, the policy rate. One of the biggest damages done by change, to my mind, by changing the monetary policy framework to inflation targeting is that there's a very silly focus now on what is the Reserve Bank to do, 25 basis points, 50 basis points, etc. It's not going to make any difference. Just because, after all, the market interest rates determine the supply and demand of funds. If there are no funds, Reserve Bank can do whatever it likes. There will be some impact of it, but there will be no monetary transmission. And so, real focus on financial savings. I do want to mention also this data issue, that And it is kind of connected to that if you don't recognize the problem, and I was saying the same thing for financial savings, you can't solve it. Okay, if you think that I'm getting 7.5% growth with business as usual, why should I do anything special? Why should I make any effort? If, however, the growth is lower, I don't know if it is, but what I do know is that the data as far as manufacturing is concerned are not consistent. Because the national accounts data suggests that it's around 6.5%, 7% for the last many years. At the same time, the index of industrial production, the annual survey of industries, suggests it's around 4%. Okay. Second, as again was Shankar mentioned, that manufactured goods export growth is 0 for 7 years. How can you get 7% overall manufacturing growth if export growth of manufactured goods is 0? Another indicator, and these indicators are real indicator, another indicator, the import of capital goods, sort of growth in the import of capital goods, also 0, slightly negative actually, last 6-7 years. How can industry be growing if there's no growth in investment? Similarly, from the IIP data, growth in the production of capital goods, last 6-7 years, also 0. So my point on this, Tarun, is only this, that look, I don't know whether national account data are correct or not, whether they are understated by the way that Arvind Subramanian is claiming. What I do know is these data are not consistent. I'm not able to interpret what is happening. And there are similar results if you look at the corporate profitability and other data. So here my point is only that in terms of the government's actions, they really need to drill down and explain to themselves and to all of us how you resolve this inconsistency. And I mean, I'm very happy, of course, if national accounts are correct, because that means we're doing better than we think we are. But unless you recognize the problem, you then can't solve it. On this issue, also I would say that just like the focus on growth has been lost, the focus on manufacturing has been lost. Starting with the 50s, the whole focus was on industrial growth, industrial policy. 91 reforms also started with industrial policy. The absolute focus was manufacturing. As I've joked with you often, the CII should be renamed the CIS, the Confederation of Indian Services, not Indian Industry. That because there's no focus on manufacturing. And some of the things that both Nitin and Shankar talked about, that no country that has grown fast, including Singapore and Hong Kong in the early stages, without high growth in manufacturing. You cannot grow at 8% a year unless manufacturing growth is 10% a year, because agriculture won't be higher than 4% or so. And service will be something similar to manufacturing. We cannot grow 8% a year unless manufacturing grows at 10% a year. We've been nowhere near that. And there are many issues to do with that. Exchange rate, I fully agree with Shankar that we really fouled up on exchange rates since I left the Reserve Bank in 2009. I did manage the exchange rate for 7 years on a daily basis. And I don't understand why we're doing this. And there's a one connection with this in terms of interest rates actually, that the foreign exchange reserves have only gone up by 100 billion from 2009 over the last 10 years. There were 300 2009, there were 400 plus minus now. If we were trying to keep the exchange rate on a realistic real exchange rate basis, which would mean depreciation along with the inflation differential between us and the rest of the world, which is around 2-3%, then you'll have to buy. The Reserve Bank would have to keep adding to the reserves by buying dollars, which would then induce more liquidity into the system. And that itself would also help actually. While doing so, the exchange rate policy, foreign exchange reserve policy is also connected liquidity in the country actually. And so that I think would be one way of at least short term and not borrowing for liquidity actually. Here, there's no borrowing involved here. Another issue with manufacturing, Nitin, you mentioned small and medium. This has been one of our biggest errors of concentrating on small and medium without doing much with them either, by the way. But in some sense, we've had this thing about frowning on large manufacturing. If you look at China, Taiwan also, Korea, Japan, all the countries that have had high growth, the success is from large manufacturing companies. Same thing for exports. What is true, of course, is a successful large manufacturing company, then just what Maruti has done, you are familiar with what you did, right? With Maruti, that large manufacturing company, but huge amount of outsourcing. So it's not the case that the two are inconsistent. But what you want is, Nitin, as you were saying, you want efficient, productive, modern, small and medium, and that comes to the coattails of large, successful, large company manufacturing. So I think that is something, again, in terms of policy, you need to think, look, what do we need to do? I don't have an immediate answer, but it certainly includes labor and land reforms. We've sort of said, no, we can't do labor reforms. I don't understand why you can't do labor reforms. There are only 14 million people, labor employed in organized manufacturing. China's 100 billion, only 14 million. You can bribe 14 million people very easily. Seriously. By bribe, I mean you need that if you're going to do major labor reform, you have to convince those people who are in organized sector manufacturing that they will not be hurt. I mean, if I was among this 14 million, I would protest like mad if I'm going to be threatened. But that's easy to address, actually. If you actually, by doing measures and labor reforms, land reforms, etc., and you get large manufacturing going, you will more than double manufacturing employment. You can triple, you can quadruple in 10 years. So, but all this needs action, it needs communication. I'm not naive in the sense that, look, you have to deal with the trade unions and so on, but it can be done. And again, there's just no focus on this. One other issue, how much time do we have? Should I shut up now?
Yeah, sooner.
Okay. Animal spirits in the private sector. One of the things that's most disturbing in a sense is that the people we thought in the private sector were icons 15 years ago, so many of them have fallen. And that's very disturbing. Also in terms of companies, whatever the financials of Jet Airways or the management or mismanagement have been, but it was certainly the case 10 years ago that they provided among the best service in the world. The quality of service was among the best in the world. They have fallen. I won't go through the list because it may be embarrassing. But this is something the private sector itself needs to think about. How do we counter or bring up and bring to more prominence people who have been doing well? As they were saying, that 75% are doing well. And so you need to shore up in a sense and bring more communication to revive animal spirits, that these are the companies doing well, these are new icons, etc. I'll end up with just one point actually on the global environment, which is coming back to manufacturing, that we often say, oh, we've missed the bus. But we don't seem to understand that in one way the bus is just starting actually. That the McKinsey Global Institute, with which I'm associated, has done a recent study called Outperformers. And one calculation that comes out of that, looking to the future, is that the incremental GDP growth coming from, which we expect from China plus India plus ASEAN, about 9.2 trillion, 2015 to 2030, compared about half of that, 2000 to 2015, and this incremental growth of GDP would be higher than Europe and US combined, 2000 to 2015. Similarly, if you just look at the projection of the world imports of manufactured goods, China plus India plus ASEAN, forget the West, China plus India plus ASEAN, 2015 to 2030 is projected to be just under $4 trillion compared to about half of that in the previous 15 years. And the US and Europe was only 1.4 trillion. So that there is no shortage of demand for manufactured goods in the next 15 years, higher than ever before. So the bus is just getting into the station. If you don't get on it, you'll clearly miss it, actually. And so I'll shut up at this point, but mainly to say on growth, focus on manufacturing. So many things, you have to think of all the things you need to do to exchange rate, export processing zones, coastal zones, interest rates. I mean, there's a whole caboodle of things. Everything that our friend Jayanta Roy keeps writing about in terms of logistics, right? No one listens to him either. But among the most smart, the most thoughtful things written on this is from Jayanto. So focused manufacturing and large manufacturing will bring up the small as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just put, there are so many questions come up from what three of you have said. You've covered a very wide range of subjects. But I think the core of it seems to be government borrowing.
Government?
Borrowing. The core of it is government borrowing because they are taking away all the money, if I can put it in very simplistic terms. There's no money really left for others. I'll come to private sector and the money they're sitting on separately as a second question. But is there anything that can be done about this? How do we get government to reduce borrowing? Is that possible? Has it been done before? Has it been done elsewhere? Is there can we just spend a few minutes on this, what's to be done? Is it feasible to bring down government borrowing in 2019?
I think, Tarun, if I may, it has been done before in India. The reasons are complex, but it has been done. Because if you take the period between roughly 2002 and 2008, if my memory serves, the combined fiscal deficit of the center and the states came down from something in the order of 9+% of GDP, 9 to 10%, depending which year you start with, to, by the time you got to 2007-8, before the global financial crisis, 4%. So we've done fiscal consolidation, and anybody who says that fiscal consolidation means that you didn't have growth, that happens to be our fastest growing period.
In fact, can I just add to that? In fact, the reason for the fiscal consolidation was the growth. This was the period when you had a phenomenal increase in corporate profits and a very big increase in corporate revenue collections.
Yeah.
And because of that, it was possible to contain the budget. So it was really the growth which made it easier to contain public spending. Can I just one comment on one thing? In many ways, if you have to look at the whole area of growth, which he emphasized on, if I had to characterize the East Asian experience, I would characterize it as export-oriented backward integration.
Absolutely.
It wasn't just growth based on export, but they worked backwards. And you see that again. Now, take, for instance, in India, we are pretty successful in pharmaceutical exports, but virtually no backward integration. Practically all of the active substances our pharmaceutical industry uses are imported from China. There is no backward integration there. It happened in the case of automobiles because of Maruti. And there's a gentleman sitting here who one can turn to for an explanation. It's the one area where this has happened. And when we have seen the effects of that in other areas. So I would take, even in the services sector, we had one of the fastest and one of the most successful infotech industries in the world. in the export-oriented software industry. But no backward integration has taken place, and China has overtaken us in a whole lot of areas, apart from the creation of indigenous giants in the infotech business, also in technology, in AI and other areas. But there was no backward integration in India. And this is one of the challenges that I see. I keep saying this. My colleagues may not agree with me. I don't think the job of the government is to make India a credible place in the eyes of foreign capitalists. It should be to make Indian capitalists credible in foreign markets. To get it to a point at which you say, yes, 5 years from now, I will have a Samsung, I will have a Huawei, I will have an LG, I will have, Fox Communication. This is what I ought to be aiming at. That to have world-class Indian players in the growing areas of world markets in a certain amount of time. So I think this is what they ought to be doing, but unfortunately, that's not happening. It's not happening.
Would you buy the proposition that there is a disconnect between industry and the government?
I think the government doesn't understand industry.
Government doesn't understand.
Basically, I don't think the government...
Because there was a time when we all worked together, as a team.
Yes, we do, but I don't think government understands industry adequately, and I think there are problems at the industry end also. And it is possible that we may have to address those too, which is that is our corporate structure one which is designed for this type of high risk-taking entrepreneurship of the sort that the East Asian corporations have shown? Do we have a corporate structure which is capable of doing that? Do we have that risk-bearing capacity? Or do we have companies where the promoters are happy to stay on the safe side always? But this is not a question which I will ask, but I suggest we ask CII to ask that question.
No, I agree. I agree on this issue, Tarun. That once again, I think if you look at the Korean experience, the Japanese experience, I know less about the Chinese, but I presume it's something similar. A very organized system of government-industry interaction. The period that you are sort of referring to, 1990s to the early 2000s, I think there was much more constructive government-industry partnership or interaction. It sort of happened. It wasn't as well organized, however. It did happen, and I think
it came from a government which, even though it was a minority government in parliament, but it came from that government which had trust in industry, which was not insecure in reaching out to industry, in trying to pull industry along with it. The leader was the government. Industry became a partner, and Subodh is sitting here, and he was part of that whole process in those years.
Yeah, no, I agree. That was very much the case.
We worked together. We differed with each other also. Yes. Most of it we were differed in private. We didn't differ in public, but we did differ strongly. But we worked together.
The key thing is that corporate sector must stop using policy leverage in order to fight competition. This is the most important thing. I'm afraid, as those of us who were sitting at the other end saw it, that they were more interested in getting a policy change which would give them a 5% advantage relative to the competitor, rather than in actually focusing on the efficiency of their business, etc. So the message is, I think this.
Why has this regressed? Why we had gone beyond that?
I think.
Why did that happen?
Let me say this in all fairness. I think it is coming down now to a certain extent. This type of policy leveraging, because the room for that is much more limited. In the old days, you could fix tariffs where you liked, when you liked, how you liked. The room for that is coming down a little.
Well, unfortunately, that has got reversed the last 3 years, both in customs duties, in terms of leverage, and specific things being done, as well as the new GST, because of the structure of the GST. GST is very good, there's no question. I have not.
So, but the room for it is coming down, but it's possible.
The GST Council meets every 2 months or 3 months?
I don't think
and each time they're tinkering.
So they will tinker, and that will happen all the time. to a certain extent, but it's how much of it is driven by country, by state government interests and how much. But whatever it is, let me say that maybe this is an area which we as people involved in thinking about policy ought to be addressing. How do I do it? For instance, he mentioned tariffs, right? Tariff fixation, fixing tariffs what I was talking about is where the thing was done, not from a national interest, but in order to, if you'll pardon me using a somewhat crude word, to screw the competition, you see. So I'd say that can we think of a system going back to some type of tariff commission type, something which would make it more difficult to use policy leverage in this area, policy leverage in GST. It's usually in these types of areas. But there are other areas also. The other very difficult area in India, very difficult one, is on the whole mineral sides, and the policy leveraging which comes out, spectrum auctions, and the way in which what that does. So let me say that Indian industry must also learn to get out of using policy leverage as a primary instrument for managing competition.
So one question of private sector, Tarun, that
I'm going to go to the floor after this.
Just one question that we've talked about it before, and it came out very well in Naushad Forbes' article in our book. Basically, we had expected, when we did the 90s reforms, that with greater competition, there will be greater investment by private sector in R&D and technology. All the data show that hasn't happened. And that's a real, so this is kind of connected to this, that the industry concentrating on doing policy leveraging as opposed to investing in building their own competence to take on the world. And I don't understand why that hasn't happened.
But if industry, sorry to, I'm not speaking for industry, I'm not a spokesman for industry.
No longer, you don't no longer have
to. But Nitin,
that's in your blood.
If industry is trying to leverage policy, then someone on the other side is allowing you to leverage policy.
Yeah, that is because of the way you're
that did not happen. Yeah. There was a period of time that was out.
I think
and this guy was saying at that time, when in the 1998, the Southeast Asian financial crisis, and industry was crying, says, slow down, slow down. He said, stop whining. He said, publicly said, stop whining, because we still have to compete. We still have to build pressure.
After that, they didn't invite me for 12
Sorry,
months.
you were going to say.
I was just going to say that along these lines, that I think, and what's also been said by Rakesh and Nitin, that until 3 years ago, there was over the previous 20 years, a consistent view had grown up that, protection, whether by licensing or tariffs, was a bad thing. And it was of our past. And that we should be, every budget speech said that we're going to be at East Asian tariff levels, which meant very low or zero, round the corner. But I think in the last 3 years, that's gone. And if you don't consistently follow that route, the issues of competition and policy leveraging and essentially, rent seeking is going to be naturally coming up.
Questions? Now I promised you a dream team. I hope you will not have nightmares tonight, because you got a whole recipe of challenges and problems to deal with. But thank you all very much, and I hope we'll have you back again. Thank you so much.